Hello and welcome to Must Read Fiction, a place for people who know that life is better with a novel in hand. I'm Erin Popelka, and I'm so delighted to be here today with author Sarah Ladipo Manyika. Welcome.
Thank you so much.
So a little bit about Sarah. Sarah Ladipo Manyika was raised in Nigeria and has lived in Kenya, France, and England. She holds a PhD from the University of California and teaches literature at San Francisco State University. Her novel, Bringing Ice Cream to the Sun, was shortlisted for the Goldsmiths Prize in 2016 and the California Book Awards in 2018. Independence, this beautiful book I have in my hands right here, has sold over 3 million copies since its initial release in Nigeria. So let's just start with Independence. Please tell me about the book.
Well, thank you so much again for having me on your show. Independence is, at its core, it's a love story. Who doesn't enjoy a great love story? And there are two main characters. My character, Tayo, leaves Nigeria at the dawn of independence in the early 60s. He's won a scholarship to study at Oxford, England. And while he's at Oxford, he meets Vanessa Richardson, who is the daughter of an ex-colonial officer. And they fall in love, and it's their story that is the focus of the novel, and it spans a couple of decades. So it's a love story at heart. It's also a love story on another level. It's something of a love story to West Africa. I was dying to read a great love story that had characters who came from West Africa and that was set in this period, the 1960s, coming up to present day, and I couldn't find that story, so I tried to write it myself.
Oh, fantastic. Well, thank you. Thank you for writing that yourself. And you anticipated my next question, which is, you've said that this is the book that you wanted to read but couldn't find, and so you wrote it yourself. So can you tell me a little bit more about that process, about how that sparked the novel and what that journey was like?
I think my fiction is always driven by wanting to read certain stories that I'm not finding. And that's certainly been the case for the two novels. And it's something that Toni Morrison said, if there's a story that you really want to read and can't find, then try writing it. So at the time that I was beginning to think about the novel, which is probably about 15 years ago or so, I was finding books there were books about war, there were books that were focusing on other subjects, but I wasn't finding love stories, and particularly not love stories with main characters coming from West Africa, which I grew up in Nigeria, so I'm familiar with Nigeria in particular. I wasn't finding those stories, and these were stories that were exciting to me, and so I tried writing it. And the same thing for the second novel. I know we're not focusing on that today, but the second novel is about an older woman living in San Francisco, an expatriate woman, also from West Africa. And I was finding that I wanted to read stories about older women, older, glamorous, wonderful, amazing characters, and I wasn't finding them. And so there again, I wrote a novel that was addressing that.
Oh, delightful. Well, thank you. Thank you for noticing that gap and for doing the hard work to fill it. I really appreciate that. And you did kind of mention your second novel, so let's just take just a quick minute. So please tell me a little bit more about Like a Mule Bringing Ice Cream to the Sun.
Well, that novel is set in San Francisco, and it's about, as I said, a woman she's 74, turning 75, very independent, very flamboyant, and it's her story of her life. It's a story of her friendships. It's a story of aging and desire and sensuality. Again, I was not finding stories about older women who were sensual characters. I was finding that for men, but not for women. And yet in real life, I was meeting very sensual women, very extravagant, fabulous women, but this wasn't reflected in literature. So my main character, Mariah da Silva, is one of these fabulous women. And yeah.
Oh, fantastic. Fantastic. Well, thank you. Thank you for telling two stories that are a little bit absent in literature and for filling that gap. That is so delightful. And so you also have mentioned that you've lived internationally. And so I'm curious, how does that perspective of having lived internationally and adjusted to different cultures, how does that influence your writing?
I think it inevitably probably is one of the reasons why I write. So I have had the opportunity to travel and, as you said, to live in different cultures. And also I come from a multicultural family, as it were. My father is Nigerian, my mother is British. And so within me runs different cultures and different cultural experiences, and then just a natural curiosity for differences in cultures, but also those things that unite us. And I think if there is, you know, something, a thread that runs through both of these novels, it is something of a thread that says we are different, and yet there's so much that unites us, and we don't have to be afraid of the other. And that's a very strong thread in my fiction.
Oh, fantastic. Fantastic. And thank you. Thank you for exploring that thread, because it does sound like you're telling really different stories, both with independence and with like a mule bringing ice cream to the sun. And so the fact that there is still that common denominator of kind of universal experience and universal human experience, that sounds just really lovely and really empowering. That's fantastic.
Well, it's actually interesting as you're speaking, because in a way I see that there's a continuity with the titles as well. So independence is a sort of a play on the word independence, as in political movements, independence movements around the time that the story begins. But it also plays to this notion of independence and interdependence between people in a relationship, between countries, between cultures. And independence for a woman in her 70s is also an interesting notion that I explore and play with. A character who wants to be independent and continue to be independent, and yet as we age, there are factors that weigh into that sometimes put brakes on how much, how much independence can we have and what is independence. So you just have me riffing on another thread that I see. Yeah.
That's great. That's great. And it is really interesting too, these questions that kind of come up over multiple works, right? I do find that novels and literature is just such an interesting medium, because oftentimes they're really big questions. And if we could have answered that question any shorter, we would have, right? Like sometimes a novel is an answer to a question or an exploration on a theme. And sometimes, and it needs to have some space in it, have some time. And so with that idea, I'm just you gave an interview to Brittle Paper, and you gave a quote that I just love that said, "I, for one, frequently write from a place of restlessness." And as long as we're riffing, I would just love to hear a little bit more about this question of restlessness and how it works its way into your writing, and if it has any ripple effects on your day-to-day as well.
I think all artists probably are restless. You have to be. There has to be something that drives you to want to create, that drives you to want to explore questions. And so I think probably that's what I was getting at. I mean, the term restlessness can also encompass curiosity. So there's also the element of curiosity as a writer. And perhaps also the element of never fully fitting in. And this maybe perhaps ties back to what you were saying earlier about having lived in different places. I feel that I belong in a number of different places, milieus, nations, and also don't belong. So there's this business of being an insider to the extent of having experienced different cultures and places, but also never fully being 100% one thing or another. So perhaps that's also an element of the creative restlessness.
Yes, absolutely. And restlessness is such an interesting place, because you're right. It means that like you're not quite comfortable, but you're right. Sometimes that's how great art is born, right? That something just doesn't quite feel right and something needs to be made. And so honoring that restlessness means making something and bringing something into the world. So it's a really interesting idea to think about as a birthplace of art. That's lovely.
Yeah, I think so. And I certainly I always enjoy hearing artists talk about what inspires them, what drives them to write, or what drives them to create, because, and there has to be that strong drive, because writing, I don't think I've spoken to any writer or any creator who will say that it's just kind of very easy, that you sit back and leisurely, you know, paint or leisurely write. I mean, there are moments when you do that, but there is a certain amount of challenge and struggle as you try and land on the story that you want to write.
Sure, sure. And this actually is a lovely segue into the next question I have, which is a little bit more about the process. And so I also read that you said that, quote, almost all books inspire me to write. And so I think that this is such an interesting idea. Can you speak a little bit more about that? Like, what is it about all books and all creations that are an inspiration for you?
Well, I think when I talk about writing, what's at the heart of writing for me is storytelling. So I am interested in stories. That's kind of the bottom line. So when I made a reference to all books inspiring me, I guess what I was sort of saying is all attempts to tell a story, to frame a story, are of interest to me. I'm very interested in how stories begin, how they are told. And so even if a story is told badly, I'm interested in exploring, well, why is that story told badly? Or why do I not feel compelled by that story? What would make the story compelling? And when a story is told really well, then it makes me want to explore, you know, what has made that story so good. So, you know, just as we're talking, I'm just thinking about two books I've read recently, one fiction and one nonfiction. The nonfiction book is entitled The Resurrection of Winnie Mandela by Sisonke Msimang. Now I'm embarrassed because I'm not sure I'm pronouncing her last name correctly. But anyway, it's The Resurrection of Winnie Mandela. And so this is a nonfiction, and she's taken someone who was quite a controversial figure, and she's tried to write fully and roundly about this character, and I think she does it extremely well. And then the other book that I'm just almost finished reading via audiobook is Milkman by Anna Burns. And you know, I'm fascinated by the way that she so seamlessly kind of interweaves history and characters and issues and the dangers of certain narratives and the power of mistrust and you know, so, and I'm just, as I'm listening to it, I'm enjoying the narrative and the way that she has woven this particular narrative. And I'm trying, as a writer myself, I'm trying to figure out, you know, how does she do it? Yeah.
Sure, sure. And that's so interesting too, thinking about like certainly the nonfiction piece, right? That like we are really complicated humans, right? And there's, you know, kind of painting a whole picture and showing some of that complexity. Like oftentimes there's not easy answers. And I think that fiction also does that in a really beautiful way, right? And that you can see all of some of those inner lives, all of some of the forces that go into play for each decision and each question along the way. And so it just gives like a tapestry behind things that maybe seem straightforward, but are almost never straightforward. So it sounds like what an interesting juxtaposition to have those two books side by side too.
Yeah, and I think, you know, various writers have talked about the purpose of art and writing, and you know, Baldwin talks about how as writers we are there to bear witness. We're not necessarily there to give answers, but there to bear witness, there to shine a light. And that for me is the very powerful role that writing and art in general can play in society.
Lovely. So great. And so I'm going to flash independence one more time for my last question. I would just love to hear. So this book is celebrating its 10-year anniversary. It is being re-released 10 years later. So I would just love to hear you talk a little bit more about the first 10 years of independence being in the world and what you're hoping for the next 10 years.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's amazing to have a book in the world for 10 years and to have it brought back. And it's such an honor that has been the case. And, you know, one of the reasons why the book has sold so many copies, many more than I would ever have dreamt of, is because it has been assigned and been on syllabi across Africa and also beyond. And so it's been amazing for me to have lots of students read it, lots of people contacting me, wanting to know more about writing, how to write, and that's been a real honor and pleasure. As you know, I've written these 2 novels, but I don't just write novels, I also write nonfiction. So in between novels in particular, I focus on nonfiction. So since writing the 2nd novel, I've been busy writing quite a few profile pieces, actually. So I wrote a profile piece on Toni Morrison, one on Michelle Obama, and I'm working on another right now. So that's one of the things that I'm doing as I'm beginning to just start work on a new novel, the 3rd novel. And Independence is historical fiction. Like A Mule Bringing Ice Cream to the Sun was pretty much set in present day. And the book that I'm working on, the next novel that I'm working on, is set a little bit in the future. So.
Oh, delightful. What a fantastic teaser. Excellent. Well, thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Please do keep up the great work. I can't wait to. We will have to have another conversation when the next book is ready and out into the world. But in the meantime, I just want to take another moment, celebrate this beautiful book. Happy 10-year anniversary to independence. Congratulations on its re-release. And thank you. Thank you, Sarah, so very much for taking the time to speak with me today.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure, and thank you for all that you do.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks.